Hello everyone, my name is Angie Judge from Dexibit. Thank you very much for joining us here for a great session on money, data and power. Over the last few years, we've been building out a big data analytics solution specifically for the cultural institution, and we've also been busy implementing that in lots of different museums, so big ones, small ones, free ones, paid ones, art, science, history, you name it. And so today I really wanted to share three things, one being how analytics delivers value for the museum, two on how to go about doing that in your own institution, and then three, most importantly, some great use cases to help demonstrate how analytics delivers on its promise. I think analytics is a relatively new technology still, particularly in this industry. But when we started out a few years ago, two museums did at the same time as well, the Art Institute of Chicago and the British Museum. And over the last couple of years, as we've each built out our own big data analytics capability, we've all been keeping in touch and very much learning from each other's work. And so today it's a great privilege to be able to present with Andrew Simnick, who is the Senior Vice President for Finance Strategy and Operations at the Art Institute of Chicago, here with me so that you can see two very parallel experiences and a sort of buy versus build bake-off from a museum perspective. We are, though, today missing Shauna Ashby from the British Museum, so she was unable to travel to be with us here today. But if you enjoyed today's talk, I would highly recommend following her work as well. So shortly, I'm going to hand over to Andy to introduce their analytics approach at the Institute. But before I do, I just wanted to really set the scene for what the big data analytics use case or business case looks like. We have a great little ROI tool, which I'm really happy to share if anybody wants to hit me up afterwards about it. But the big takeaway here is that the business case for analytics usually has two halves. The first half is the quick wins that it delivers. So this is the work where people are logging into lots of different systems and they're copying and pasting data out of there into spreadsheets and making graphs and PowerPoints, doing very manual analysis, circulating PDFs. You know, we all know the drill. And that time that the staff spend doing that can add up to maybe half an FTE in a small institution, but often several FTEs in a larger institution. So it's not a huge saving, but it is a very direct and very quick one. But I think the business case for analytics is so much more exciting on the other side, the upside, which is all of the value it can deliver indirectly. And the reason why we separate these out is on the other side here, these benefits like increasing revenue or operational efficiency or maybe social objectives, they are indirect because they need our staff to look at the data, analyze or determine insight from it, and most importantly, take action. And that's why we separate them out, because to achieve these things, simply turning on a big data analytics solution won't get them for you. We have to create change to get people to have that effect. And with that, I am going to hand over to Andy.
All right, well, thank you, Angie. So I'm Andy Simnick. As Angie said, I'm the Senior Vice President of Finance Strategy and Operations at the Art Institute. It's kind of a mouthful. And starting with money, data, and power, that's kind of an intimidating phrase, but it's okay. Thanks for coming anyway. My background, I'm not a museum guy. I come from a combination of engineering in the academic world and management consulting. And I joined the Art Institute about 4 years ago, working in kind of a one-man show in strategic planning. And you know, the Art Institute is a real special place, and we are a very large museum, small by large corporation standards, but pretty big for our industry. So we have, let's turn my back here. So we have about $750 million endowment. Combined with the School of the Art Institute, it's over $1 billion. We also are the only major museum with a functioning art university within the corporation, which is a huge advantage, but a driver of complexity. We have routinely balanced our operating budget. This past fiscal year, we ended with about $1 million surplus. on a base of about $110 million. Again, big for a museum. We have about 7,000 works on display, and we have a head count of about 900, full-time, part-time, and contractors. So it's a complex organization. There's real activity. And when I came in, it's not a normal business. It's a great business, an important business, but it's not normal. And this was something that I used with my team to understand how it all fits together. And if you really think about it, a museum is the collection, the people that work with the collection, and the facility that protects the collection. So that's kind of it, right? That inner circle. We have a wide range of products, right? So we have a visitor experience, we have exhibitions, we have an education program, we have research, we have ideas for the field, all tying back to that collection. And then you think about our audiences, that's even broader, right? So we have students, we have donors, we have visitors, we have scholars, we have collectors. It is really, really, really convoluted, but it all comes back to this collection. And unlike other companies, we have challenges as an industry. So we don't have a single metric for success. Sometimes it's bottom line, sometimes it's feet in the door, sometimes it's reputation, sometimes it is citations. We also have a mismatch between scope and scale. For that breadth of products and customers and service lines, even as a large museum, we're under-resourced. We have to really be smart about how we use our time and our money to be able to have the scope we want at the scale we are. We have limited quantitative experience, right? So not everybody is an analyst at the Art Institute. That's okay. That's not where the strength of the institution lies. But we also have less room for error. Since we don't have the money, the time, the experience, we have to be smart in how we play in the analytics space. And I've always been kind of a data guy, but it really became important at the Art Institute in that data solves this by helping us understand the different business models that exist within our museum. So you take those concentric circles, all together, it's tough. It's hard to have a rational discussion. It's hard to make clear decisions. You break those apart, many of these problems have been solved in other industries in simple ways, and data has really let us move fast in picking out individual components that matter to us, rationally understand what's going on, make smart decisions, and then move on in a more sustainable and faster way. So this is our general approach over time. What we do is rely heavily on three components. First, we have a centralized data warehouse. So we take any data set we can get our hands on, ranging from high-end enterprise systems that are built for this sort of thing to translating paper records in a smart way. It all comes together in one spot. We have, we'll call it the data and blending and preparation area, where we have some home-built algorithms, we have some off-the-shelf products, and we have a really, really good team that puts it all together. And then we use visualization and other methods of communication to getting the information people need in their hands in a way that they want to engage with it. So it could be a visual representation, it can be a table, it can be a scatter plot. Just different folks respond better to different things, which I'll talk about in a second. But this has been our general approach for the last 3 years. It's been built a little piecemeal, but it's stable, it's up and running, and it really has done the trick for us. So building in this strategy, given our scale and our needs, seemed to be the right answer, and looking back, thankfully it was. So the first question we ever tackled was, what is driving our attendance? And we all talk about attendance, but attendance for us is really, really important. We are dependent on earned revenue. We're about a third earned revenue, a third philanthropic income, a third endowment income, and earned revenue has been becoming a bigger piece of the pie. We've grown admissions revenue 10% year over year for the last 5, which we are incredibly proud of for the industry. But we have to keep that going. We can't rest on our laurels because our institution and our ability to deliver on non-revenue generating activities depends on this engine. And attendance underpins not just ticket sales, but membership onboarding, shop sales, membership renewals. So if we understand what's driving feet in the door, we can get a really good handle on other parts of our business that we have more control over in the near term to manage our finances. And this is what we would look at previously, a little cleaner, but our attendance is up and down. There's lots of jagged lines, and every week we would look at our total number. We'd say, are we up, are we down? And people would either tell a positive story or panic with any variation. We didn't know why, right? So if you take a 3-year average, it's pretty much flat. You see some seasonality, some linkage to exhibitions, but you just see some parts that are just kind of erratic, that are periodic, but we didn't have a really good way to handle it. I met my partner in crime, Matt Norris, who also couldn't be here today. We looked at each other in a meeting, like, well, not all visitors are created equal. Like a tourist from the UK is probably different than somebody coming in on a lunch break from across the street. So let's see if we can figure out see if there is something we can pull out. So all we did was filter on zip code and replot it. And this is the US fly market. Consider this US residents 8 hours or greater outside of Chicago. Seasonality really jumps out. You start to see this sine wave where we rise and fall with peaks in the summer, valleys in the winter, because everybody loves Chicago in January. and a little bit of correlation, just eyeing it, to major exhibitions, but that seasonal pattern really dominates. Compare that to membership, which is about 90% Chicagoland. It's a tabletop. It is flat, except when we have a major show where you see these increases. And the increases are pretty much consistent, except when you have a major show, such as Van Gogh's Bedrooms in 2016 there, where you do see almost an order of magnitude, but a pretty significant change. But again, tourism, we rise and fall at the market. Membership, it's our event schedule. But you can't really forecast or tell how you're doing in an automated way, just with those insights. So we wanted to take it a step further. We then took our database of attendance. We tested 200 internal and external factors using multivariate regression and communicated the results visually. So the idea is, let's figure out what actually drives, what correlates to differences, what's the magnitude of these factors, and then what can we do with that to make smarter decisions. And this was the end result. So this was the first, say, heavy analytics visualization we launched at the museum. What this is, we call this our attendance dashboard. For some of the folks from Chicago, you may recognize this. If not, we should talk about it. But what we have on top is, in red, the actual attendance by week, blue, the expected attendance by week, and this is based on the regression model underpinning, based on these factors, what it should be. And then at the bottom, going back to the idea of borrowing from other industries, we took this from manufacturing. It's called a control chart. All it does is show statistical variation over time. But you don't need to know p-values, just if it's not a solid circle and above the line, something good happened. If it's not a solid circle, below the line, something bad happened. And if it's a solid circle, don't worry about it. It's just variation. We launched this initially in the second half of 2014, right before we were named #1 in the world in TripAdvisor. What we saw in this model is that we saw a jump in local ticketed attendance. Not tourism, not membership, but local ticketed, which is the group we feel that we have the most agency over for drawing new visitors. We then saw this bump here. We made the decision to pivot our marketing from tradition, which has been whatever exhibition is seen as the major show at the time, to the #1 ranking in the world, which we had foam fingers. We tried to Photoshop our director on top of a double-decker bus holding the Stanley Cup, but we didn't go that far. But what we saw is when we came into tourist season after pushing the #1 rating in the world, we saw another lift, and that lift continued across all of the different segments. So we started to draw more tourists. Now, is it this? Was it a halo effect? Was it a combination of programming? We feel pretty good about TripAdvisor given the timing of it, but what we do know is that if you take the area under the curve in those areas with a statistical lift, that's over $2 million net. So that's a really big impact for not having to spend any more time or money. That's just letting the data help us make a decision. And since then, we've been relying on this heavily. We have several more years of data, and we've been able to use it in new ways. So going from near-term diagnostics and making decisions in the moment to long-range forecasting. So here we have our attendance for FY17. The red is our projection. So that was at the beginning of the fiscal year where we thought it was going to be based on the computer. Blue is actual, or red is actual, blue is projected. Apologies for that. Altogether, you see some periods where we overperformed, some where we underperformed. At the end of the year, we had less than 1% error off the original projection, which went over really well with Finance Committee. It's also something that allowed us to really know that we did what we set out to do. We performed as expected. We didn't really move the needle on anything, but it really gives us confidence that we have a better control over our earned revenue. This is moving again for 18. We do see a little more variation in the numbers, but again, it's allowing us to know where we're at relative to where we need to be to hit our long-term goals. It's given us a new way to evaluate. So we no longer have to do week to week or year to year. We can go actual to expected. So here we have 2 years of a membership onboarding data. So membership links very closely to feet in the door. What we saw is in FY16, we had a giant increase in membership enrollment, and this was tied to Van Gogh's bedrooms. It was a generational event for us. We had hour-plus lines, and membership allowed you to cut the lines. So we saw a ton of folks going to this channel, which is great from a revenue perspective. We also didn't think a lot of these folks were going to renew. It was like a transactional moment. And if you talk to the membership folks on a year-over-year comparison from 16 to 17, the sky is falling. Right? We have an over 40% decrease in onboarding relative to the same time period. But if you compare it to where we should be, controlling for that generational exhibition, membership team doing great. They're right where they're supposed to be. So when you have a situation where something lifts all boats, it's wonderful in the near term, but we can't overreact to that and use that to gauge our performance going forward. So it's just a way to have a more rational discussion of are the revenue teams performing to where they need to be with the things in their control. And one that gets me very excited. So as the operations guy, I've been preaching this term complexity reduction. I want us to do things simple and easy because we don't have a lot of time to get everything done. We've also linked this to our shop revenue. So this is top line on-site shop sales, tying to expectations. What you don't see in here is a lot going on behind the scenes. We've had an aggressive reduction in SKU count. We've written off about $1 million in excess inventory. We've been able to consolidate our footprint, bringing more of the employees on site, as well as free up enough storage space to exit one of our warehouses. We also are shrinking the square footage of the shop and figuring out other things we can do with the space. But we've been able to do all this without messing with top line sales. So even though our sales haven't grown or where they're expected, our margin is great right now. That's one of our strongest performing areas. Again, having a clear view of where we should be has allowed us to really experiment rapidly in ways that we previously would have considered too great of a risk, but to watch our performance as we go and course correct as needed. So again, speed, precision, and it just makes the team feel real good seeing the results of what they're doing. So the other part of this is what audiences are we serving? So it's not just feet in the door. It's, we have a lot of different programs and they have different objectives. And when I first joined the museum, we're real big into market segmentation. And market segmentation is a good thing, but it has its limits and it's super resource intensive, at least in the traditional sense. So you could do a survey of Chicagoland and that tells you, all right, we appeal to folks that like visual arts. It's great, it's a very actionable insight. But then you get to the museum segmentation. So how do visitors that come into the museum, what's their mindset? What's their motivation? What are some of the pen portraits you can have of visitors? But really, we want to get to program level. So if our goal is to attract millennials that have not been to the museum before, that's a different measure of success in a different segment than attracting the tourist from New York that has us on the cycle of places to go see. And the challenge is to get to programming, you have to be able to develop a bespoke segmentation for each one of these. And we previously weren't able to do that. This past year, we think we have a method to do it with being able to create a bespoke segmentation I think our turnaround time is now a day, which is really exciting. So you chose membership as our initial use case for this. So we have great data, we have location information, and with that business intelligence core, we're able to blend demographics, psychographics, geographic data, and we're able to map them out. So what we show here is these are the census blocks in Chicago with, we'll say, 80% of the membership concentration in the city. What we've seen going down to census blocks, it gives us a level of precision you can't get with zip codes, especially in a city as dense as Chicago. But then what we can do is take this, run some real basic machine learning algorithms on it, and identify where else should we be looking for membership? Where are we underpenetrated in the market? Let the computer do the work, replot it, and then really be able to get super precise about where we want to go next for, in this case, membership. But there's nothing stopping us from using the same approach for other types of programs. If we see a program that draws well with rotational families, for instance, the folks that love the shed but don't give us the time of day, this tool allows us to see what are some of the things we should be looking for, what are some of the messages we should be putting out, what else can we learn to draw that particular audience. And also, where should we not be spending our time, right? So if this is one zip code in Chicago. For membership, if we have $1 left to spend, I would rather the team put that marking towards one of the dark blue areas, just because there's likely to be a higher return. It doesn't mean we'd always go there for every investment. For that particular business model, we can really focus our energy and free up resources to pursue other activity. And we've extended this. We've used it for e-commerce. We recently decided to exit the mail order business in our museum shop, and part of it had to do with the alignment of segmentation and pivoting towards a channel that's more in line with core segments of the museum to bring it closer to the mission, closer to the collection, and ultimately we're seeing sales growth as well. Lectures and performances. We have a very broad portfolio. We can now really understand who's coming to what and how to message more effectively. The visiting families, that's, I'm a big believer in getting more kids into the museum. And then community outreach. What works? Every art museum is trying to go further in the community. We have a way to test to see if we're successful, which is really, really powerful and super exciting. So we're, in my current role with combining finance and strategy and operations into one umbrella, we're really trying to take data as far as we can to make the museum run lean. So we've been using it to look at our collection. So here on the right, you see a scorecard showing objects in the gallery that have an image on the web. Blue, they have an image, red, they don't. When we started the project, we were at about a 70% success rate with this. We're above 99% now. Just by visualizing it and delivering it in a different way, we saw productivity go up 2 to 3x, and without more money, more people, just working smarter. It also shows we have a little bit of work to do when I get back to Chicago, but that's okay. It's a little bit of work. We can evaluate programs more effectively. We can measure the visitor experience. Facility management, the idea of Internet of Things, sensor data, and smart facility design is super intriguing, and we're starting to scratch the surface there. And then operational excellence, so process design, staffing models. There's a lot we can do here. And it all ties together of just having just the basic information to get things done. Along the way, just real quickly, we believe in playing the strengths of visual communication, asking the right questions, but a limited number of them. Lean processes are super important. If we can't scale, we failed. We've created an asset we can't leverage, and that takes away time and money. The personal element's critical. You know, we're in a museum. We are all passionate people. We all want to see the museum succeed, and we're all human. So if you find things along the way that aren't new insight or questionable insight, you want to make sure you deliver it with tact. And practical is better with perfect. You know, we want to get new ideas out there, get some wins, and keep building momentum. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Angie, and thanks.
We have time for a few minutes of Q&A, if you like.
Hmm?
Yeah, so this is, first off, super cool. So my question is, how do you guys account for, specifically the membership, the way you're structuring the membership stuff, like where you want to dedicate your money? Like, what's the worry here of increasing marginalization by focusing on communities that have the resources to become members or the resources to visit the museum, or populations who are generally just more part of the culture of museums?
Mm-hmm.
But you could increase marginalization by using this, like making this business case that that would contribute to greater discrimination of people in the museum world.
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. And for us, it's having different channels. So for instance, through some of these analytic tools, we were able to structure a program to give free admission to the museum for all Chicagoans under 18. So we're able to structure a program and a gift that allowed us to do that in a income-sensitive way. We also have programs for school kids. When they come in, they leave with a pass to bring families back. That's one of the most geographically diverse programs we have, which again gives another channel to engage with the museum. We have a very robust community engagement program, especially around teen engagement, which we're trying to scale up. It's a little more resource intensive, but we're trying to pick and choose where we go. We also partner with the city in a program called Park Voyagers that gives us presence in different parks around the city as well. And all of these go in with the intent to bring more new audiences and a more inclusive approach to museum attendance. And we completely agree with you. That was in that slide, that's one of the things that really jumps out. You're like, wow, that's something. But then when you overlay the other programs we have enough channels where we're not the best. We can always do better. But taking membership as far as the whole portfolio, we have a much richer view of the city, and we believe we touch a greater portion of Chicago. If that helps.
Yeah, no,
All right,
totally.
awesome.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more about the data warehouse?
Mhm.
How you guys set that up? And
Yeah.
what you're using for it?
Yeah, so it's SQL based. I'm not sure. I believe it's on the Azure platform. My colleague would have to be here to talk more about the tech side, but it's home built. It's installation on site, and admittedly, it's a little bit bootstrapped versus having a really robust, professionally designed system.
And is it sort of like a nightly sync from all those various silos into the warehouse?
Yep, 5 a.m. every morning.
Okay.
Mhm.
How receptive are curators and exhibition committees to maybe seeing some of the data about how effective their shows or their choices are to driving attendance?
Yeah, it's been counterintuitive, but it's helped. So before we started really pushing the analytics, every exhibition we had would be scored on attendance. How many feet did you bring in the museum? And we have tons of exhibitions that have a mission component, have a collection component, have a scholarly component that we know going in aren't going to draw heavy attendance. I mean, my personal favorite exhibition in my time at the museum, which was the Christopher Wool show, there's no marginal attendance. But I think what's been good is we've been able to allow the curators to really define the exhibitions they want to have, and we use the tool to understand what's the ripple effect on the revenue and how can we enable those shows that we know going in are unlikely to draw a marginal crowd, but are still critical for us to uphold that reputation for scholarship and quality. Also, with the collections dashboard, what I don't show here, we've done some work with the data warehouse to show growth of the collections over time and worked with the curators to present the history visually to their collection committees, and the excitement around that has been astounding. It's not super complicated, but just a new way to look at it. So we've been able to find ways to engage and really let the curators do what they do best. And we've actually had more pushback from other departments in curatorial.
So actually in the collections side,
Yep.
one thing I've been interested in lately is like, so museums want to diversify their collections. Like, what does it actually look like from like a data point of view?
Mhm.
So like, I've been examining gender represented by the artists in our collection, and so like, but from a curatorial perspective, like nobody's like thinking like, oh, we need to like go above 51% on like women every year in order to increase that statistic, like the amount of women that are represented in the collection. So like I was wondering if you had thought about like expanding this to like acquisitions or something, and like helping to kind of figure out where we should be dedicating acquisition resources.
Mm-hmm. So the acquisition decision is far out of my purview. Mm-hmm. So I can watch the money, but what we buy, the curators have control over that. What we have done with this, part of our strategic plan right now is to expand our reach in non-Western areas, particularly China, Japan, and what we've been able to do with these tools is really highlight the geographic density of our collection, as well as understanding what the spread is across different departments. Like, for instance, our textile department has been collecting globally for many, many, many years and has never really gotten the credit for it on the same level as a more geographically oriented department. So by being able to take what they have, put the center of production on a map, it's really mind-blowing how good of a cover they have. Additionally, we've been able to visualize where our objects are in the world at any given point in time. Like, we are lending internationally and not just to Western Europe. Beyond that, I'd have to defer to the curator to say, where do we want to go next? But it has been really interesting to see how we've been able to answer questions such as that, and the response has been quite good. All right.
Thank you so much. Do you want to? Yeah. Back in action. So for my part today, I thought I would share with you first my take on the 3 most common questions that I get asked about museums approaching analytics. The first question is, do I need to throw people at this, and if so, who? So we see 2 different types of approaches here, and I think that both of them are equally as good as each other. And I don't want to suggest that one is better suited to a particular type or size of museum either. We work with a museum who has less than 250,000 visitors a year, who has a full data team, including data scientists. And we work with a museum that has over 5 million visitors a year who have no dedicated data science staff. So I think both models work. But by centralized, what I mean is a team that whose job solely is to make this work. Maybe they report into the CFO, maybe it's the CTO or CDO, maybe they are a direct part of the C-suite. This is a big trend that we're seeing in the commercial sector, like a chief data officer or a chief insights officer. So again, there's lots of variation and options here to think about. I think where this team is housed says something about what the museum's driver is for big data analytics, you know, what their primary business benefit that they're hoping to achieve. The next question is then, of course, what skill set this group might have. Are they primarily there to advocate the cause within the museum? Do they come from a statistical background or a traditional evaluation one? Do they need a purely analytical skill set, or are they needing some technical skill set as well? And if so, does that need to be writing a SQL query, or is it modeling in R, or is it going as far as needing Python skills? So these are all the sorts of things that I think are important to consider on that front. The alternate method is to decentralize ownership throughout the museum, and this is a really popular approach that we see when budgets are constrained, but I don't think it should be the only reason to consider that. And in fact, it's a great way of embedding analytical capability at the edge where it's needed most, and it works equally well even if you do have that centralized team to be able to mix that with a working group and help them remain connected with the parts of the museum who are using this data. So bringing together a group of people, pooling ideas, training analytical skills, and then letting that organically spread throughout the museum. The top groups that we see involved here are digital and IT, marketing and membership, visitor services and experience, and then finance and operations. But it's also really useful if someone from the museum group in that community takes the project manager's role, because there is quite a bit of housework involved, particularly in the early stages of going down this pathway around security and data integrity and integration challenges. So it's good to have a single point of call for that. The second thing that I wanted to look at is systems, and Andy put up a similar slide to this, I think, although horizontal. So here's the vertical version. This, to be honest, is just a cut and paste of our architecture under the hood at Dexibit. So I've tried to make it solution agnostic so you can copy and paste it into your own museum, no matter your circumstance. But if I start at the bottom here, like Andy mentioned, one of the first things is to decide on what data sources you're going to draw from. So that might be footfall or ticketing, digital interactives, Wi-Fi presence, NPS, point of sale, email marketing, CRM, social, Google, tourism stats. I mean, you name it, it's out there. You know, you could easily rack up a couple of hundred data sources around the museum if you tried. But what we've got to do is pull all of that information together in one spot, so that's the data warehousing that was mentioned before, and clean it up and make it accessible and usable for the museum. So that is the hardest part, because once we've got that, we can then provide insight, we can do modeling, machine learning, all of the fancy stuff on top, and then the last thing that we need, of course, is some form of package to deliver that to the staff. I think one of the most important things when it comes to that is you do not want an analytics system that sits in the corner and can only be used by a couple of people. What you want is something that can be spread throughout the organisation, and that means delivering it to your staff in a way that feels really comfortable for them, because let's be honest, in our industry, most of people here are more interested in arts than they are in analytics. So providing them with a really comfortable digital platform to access this data is a really important part. If you do go down the build it yourself path, which I of course are very biased against, you'll need to stand up all of this infrastructure, maintain all your integrations, provision your front-end tooling, etc. But it gives you an idea of your to-do list for that. And then the toughest part, of course, is how to get everybody on board. So this is the third question I often get asked. Achieving a data-driven organisation is definitely not a case of build it and they will come. Again, given that we are all about the art and less about the analytics in this sector. So the best thing that we've found is just start small, get a little group of people together, get them talking about their challenges and their opportunities and their ideas, get a little bit of data underway, find out what works, what doesn't, what more they want, and go from there. And I think, silly as it sounds, sometimes the very simplest, smallest things can deliver really great big wins. So if you can deliver quickly and with great integrity the most trusted visitation data, maybe combine it with a little bit of inbuilt analysis around day of week, time of day, visitor behaviour on site, weather information, etc., you can really win a lot of hearts and minds around the museum team, and it's a great starting point, particularly if you've got some new exhibitions opening up. So with my rant over, I'll go through a couple of use cases. My first is also forecasting. I hope you all like graphs because I bought a few. Like Chicago, we've been looking a lot at forecasting, and over the past year, as part of our work, have built a predictive analytics engine, which is just coming out of beta now. And it uses machine learning to forecast various aspects of museum performance, starting with visitation. Our challenge, of course, is that we have to do it for lots of different museums rather than one, and we ended up with two separate models, one which is a long-range forecast which estimates daily visitation up to a year ahead, and then one which is a short-term forecast which looks up to a week or two ahead, but it goes down to the hour, and then it uses things like weather to help increase accuracy with that shorter-term view. So Andy's already talked about using the long-term one, so I thought I would talk about the short-term one. And the great use case that we see here is around operational efficiency, because if you can predict very, very accurately how many people are going to turn up to the museum, people like security, visitor services, marketing, events, they can really use that information to help their work. That becomes a really interesting use case for the museum. And here we're looking at a 14-day forecast. You can see they're closed on Sundays. I think this museum does about 250,000 visitors a year, aiming for 300. And you can see that on November 22nd, I think it's a Wednesday, they're sitting a little bit higher than normal, but with attendance a little bit later than normal. So all of that sort of thing helps if you're looking at, say, a visitor services department who are rostering staff on and scheduled breaks and that sort of thing. But what's really interesting, if we look over the far right-hand side here, is you can see as we get further into the month of November, this museum is going to go off-plan. So if I was in a marketing department here, the first thing I would be looking at is how I can throw a little bit more advertising budget to help course correct in the short term, particularly around like the 13th or the 19th there. So when you're using forecasts for those sorts of decisions, the accuracy of it suddenly becomes really, really important. And even just knowing what the accuracy is a really valuable piece of information. We need to know, are we 95% confident and therefore we can, really go strong on this data, or is it more like 80% and we need to allow for a few variations there? And that can often just be because we don't have enough information. Maybe there's a lot of regional events happening that are influencing, or other things like TripAdvisor, as Andy mentioned, that are quite unusual impacts. So both our models use about 12 months of history to analyse the past, and then they look at a bunch of what we call features, so time of day, day of week, seasonality, weekend, public holidays, school term, regional events, all of these sorts of things. And given enough data, they can get the accuracy up to around 95%. So knowing this fit of the model, how accurate it is going to be, is determined by a particular value where we train and test the model, and we can tell how much data can be explained by the model and how much can't. And that's a useful piece of information to pass on to the museum for planning. And I think what's quite fascinating is you can settle a lot of arguments in the museum with this graph on the right, which is actually just an output of it. Everybody spends a lot of time talking about how important is X, Y, Z, and of course, being able to give them the absolute answer to that saves a lot of time. So I think that's quite a polar opposite to Andy's example, but an equally valuable one on the bottom line. So to change it up into something completely different, my second use case is about my favourite topic, which is shopping. And so alongside increasing the number of people that are coming into the museum, then increasing the spend, maybe the average revenue per visitor, or called ARPU in the commercial world, particularly through upselling like retail or hospitality. This is amongst the top 3 objectives of most museums who are pursuing analytics for a commercial return. And more, I think, these days when we are looking at an exhibition, merchandising plays a really important part in the overall revenue picture. But often we wait till the end of the exhibition, maybe a few months down the track, before we actually evaluate that. This is quite the opposite, where you can see here, this is a museum that's just released an exhibition in the past week, and you can see just the start of a tail into decreasing revenue, which would be quite concerning. And we can see from the middle chart here that is coming from our merchandising, and that is affecting our average revenue per visitor, maybe only by a couple of cents, but that's all going to add up in the long term to quite a big amount. But then the more important question is then to ask why. And if we dig into this situation a bit more, we start to develop a bit of a hypothesis. So since the exhibition went in, we can see here fewer people get to the shop. They're heading straight into the exhibition, which is great, but there is an impact of that for the return. Plus, when they come out on the other side, fewer people are then making it back into the shop, so they're going elsewhere. And as a result, we're seeing less people in retail areas of the museums, and therefore fewer transactions and less overall spend. So it's not that our visitors in this case are buying less, it's just that they're not getting to the right place to make a purchase. So here, the first chart we're looking at is a heat map. This is using Wi-Fi, ticketing, a bit of admissions data, etc. And that is giving us a look at how many people are getting to the shop. This middle chart is a sunburst, so this is using just Wi-Fi, and it's showing us how many visitors are going to the shop before or after or at other times around the exhibition. And then lastly, this funnel chart here is using a mix of Wi-Fi, admissions, point of sale, and some other information, and it gives us an idea of how many people are going to the shop at some time in combination with an exhibition. So I think it's a really interesting example when you think about retailing in the museum. It is not as simple as saying X number of people came in the door and we had X amount of revenue. There's a lot more complexity here around determining why performance is going up or down on the top line there. And then lastly, probably something that is more closer to the hearts of people in this room than shopping, digital interactives, so in-gallery interactives. So I'm sure anyone in this room who's managed an in-gallery interactive project will know how difficult these kind of decisions are. Where do we put the interactives? How many do we put out on the floor? What content goes in them? How much content? What does the UI look like? And you'll also be very familiar with all the sorts of things you want to know when you've got a new install out on the floor. How many people are using it? How much? And how are they using it? And then how can we make this better? Just out of interest, these charts look a bit different to the previous ones because this is quite bespoke data that we always see coming out of digital interactives. Every single system works in a different way, so we use a different tool which isn't as pretty but much more extensible. So here we're looking at a special exhibition containing a series of digital interactives that each represent a different part of the exhibition, and then we're comparing how each of those products differ in terms of their activation rate. And we're also looking at how many people use them and the duration of that and the progression of that through the interactives journey. And what we're seeing here is a bunch of different improvements being tested over time. So that might be the position or the signage or the UI, etc. And as you can see, the activation rate is changing quite a lot as these things are being trialled out, and certain things are amping and certain things are failing. And watching this sort of data can help us understand the impact of what our visitors are doing far more effectively than just observing people in the space. So like here you're seeing three quite distinct groups of behaviour. We have people who are just using the interactive for one touch, people who are the finishers in life and they have to get to the end, and then a couple of people who sort of try a few times and then dial off. But it gives us an idea of what that split and balance is and how we should be designing for those kind of experiences. So I think in this last use case, there might not be a very direct financial benefit here, but certainly if we're investing a lot as a museum in digital interactives, we want to get the most out of that investment and govern it properly once it's out on the floor. And I think that's a critical part of the financial picture of digital in museums. So those are my three use cases. That's it from me today. And there we have it, a business case of two halves and a bunch of use cases of how it is implemented in museums, along with a few tips on people, process and technology. So love to take a few more questions if we've got time, which we do, for either Andy or I. Sure.
Harkening back to your one of your first slides, looking at the decentralized versus the centralized. So I'm with a fairly small museum where we're early in the journey, the digital journey, and I see the potential, certainly from this kind of presentation as well. I have one individual who's kind of data oriented. She manages our Blackbaud. I think you're familiar. So she's like the most data-oriented individual, and I've been thinking about like how to build her, how to build this capability within the organization, and thinking through. I'm going to speak really candidly here. Like, she's got the desire, she has the knowledge of the underlying system, but she hasn't been trained in data analytics. She hasn't gotten any kind of advanced degree in that kind of space and whatnot, and I'm speaking from ignorance. I don't know how important those sorts of things are. Like, can she grow effectively into that kind of role and ideally build a team underneath her over the next several years? Or is this something where from the outset requires such specialized skills and disciplines that I need to bring talent from the outside? Did that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Those are really, I don't know.
I think in terms of training and education, we have Elena in the room, who is one of the industry's leading educators on the topic. Would be a great person to hit up about that. But certainly I think when it comes to picking the right people, I think that passion over technical capability is almost always the most important thing. And if you're looking for a particular individual, they either have an analytical mindset to begin with, or you need to encourage that, and that's probably the harder thing to do than technically train somebody. I think the technical skills that somebody requires really depends on what kind of tech you're using underneath. If you are using a click and look tool, that's quite easy. If you are going the full extent and building it yourself, then you're going to need something much more advanced than that. And it'd be interesting to hear Andy, but I think from what I've seen in museums, finding the right person to lead something grassroots on the ground is great. The executive support and advocacy for that cause is far more important. So the museums that we see who move faster and further with analytics are the ones who have support right at the very top, whether that's board, CEO, or C-suite. Sure, they've got to have people underneath them following along, but that is the most important thing that will progress that.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly right with the kind of top-to-bottom support. And when we started at the museum, it was even 4 years ago. A lot of the tools like Tableau was relatively novel, right? We had to teach ourselves. The individual who built the stack, like he had a CS background, but now when I look to hire, and we've expanded the team by 2, so we're still pretty lean. Neither one of them, I kind of like humanities backgrounds in my analysts now, because I think the value, there's a huge arbitrage in the ability to ask questions, because a lot of the tools to do the analytics are becoming easier and easier and cheaper to use. So, and the data is getting easier and easier to pull out of systems. So the skill set you needed 5 years ago is not the skill set today. I think that being said, given that it's happening so fast, I'd anchor on an inquisitive mind, an ability to learn, and to do what you can to get support top to bottom in the organization. When it works, the individual who is inquisitive will skyrocket and take on so much responsibility so fast. When it doesn't work, you're gonna spend a lot of time and money and the person's gonna get frustrated. So I think it's like, I agree with Angie, alignment's critical.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes.
So I've seen a lot of these great data visualizations, and I'm wondering, for organizations who are just getting started out, where we may have, data sets located across a number of different places, if you had programs or tools or skill sets that you'd recommend towards beginning to merge those.
Yeah, I think that's where I always like to talk about data visualization like an iceberg. The bit that we see is just the very, very tip, and all of the heavy lifting is underneath the water. And if you look at either one of our slides, when you look at the solution stack, the data visualization is a really small box compared to everything else. And bringing it all together and cleaning it up. I mean, Wi-Fi data, what you saw back a few on those sunburst charts, that is not what Wi-Fi data looks like to begin with. So I think they're understanding that is all sitting behind the waterline is really, really important. And at the end of the day, the nice visualization that you put on the top is the cherry on the cake. I think in terms of skill set, the ability to read it rather than write it is far more important. So, there are a lot of people in the world that can produce visualizations, but the kind of skill set and leadership that can look at them and determine and act on insight is far more important. So, I'd be keen to continue a discussion if you wanted some particular advice on what visualizations to use, but no matter what tooling, I think those things are relevant.
I'm sorry, I thought I kind of meant the other direction. So the visualizations are lovely, but how do we go about collecting tools for collecting, like you mentioned, census tract, and I know that we collect zip codes and addresses, but how do we go about creating a census tract map?
So if we can, I will explain how we do it offline. Before we really got the warehouse up and running, we used the census data and our counts and a lot of VLOOKUPs. Frankly, we used Excel before we had our installation going. The most important thing, if you have the question right, you can do a lot of filtering to get the subset you need just to get that one proof of concept. Those sinusoid graphs, that was just filtering on a zip code table. So it wasn't a lot of heavy lifting. There's a lot of heavy lifting in the forecasting models, and in the segmentation is a lot of heavy lifting. But if you're just getting started, just find a subset that answers a question you want to work with, and then just go from there.
We have time for one or two questions if there's any last ones. Yeah.
I understand that once you see data or some deviation from projection, that you therefore do some sort of action to try to bring it to where you want it to be. And I think the fact that this is actionable is key. But I was wondering whether this is ever used in sort of a pure experimentation model to use different strategies simultaneously to see what is more effective with the audience. What you're thinking about the most elementary model being direct mail, where they send out 4 different approaches and are constantly tweaking based on responses.
Yeah, I think this is quite a big concept in the digital side of things, which is called split testing or A/B testing, where you can try out the same in the same environment with everything else remaining the same, a few different variations, and it can be something really as small as, you know, changing the color on a website button or something. But there's also the version of how this then, how split testing can happen in the physical world as well, around exhibitions. So, for example, even still going back to the digital space, having 2 gallery interactives side by side, each running a slightly different version of itself, would be an example of a split test. And in your case, as you mentioned, sending out the same mailer and having 2 different variations of that and seeing what codes are coming back into the museum in terms of what content or copy is working would be another. So I think split testing is definitely a really, really good discipline to build in the museum in both the digital and the physical sense, to make sure that there is sort of that lean, hypothesis-driven data thinking behind the decisions that are being made over any number of big or small choices.
Yeah, I'll actually jump in because we have 2, I'll stand up, I can't see it down here. So a couple years ago, we ran a control experiment to gauge the effectiveness of mailing to members. So what I didn't show, we have individual level renewal scoring, almost like Capital One for every household in our database. Excuse me. We broke them up into cohorts and mailed at different frequencies throughout the year, and as a result, took our mailing cost down by about $400K without seeing a drop in renewals. We're also running controlled experiments right now on pricing in different object classes in our shop. So what we have that tool up and running. We've seen through price increases on things like magnets, mugs, the kind of stuff that the curators are going to hate but drive margin like nobody's business. So far, it looks like we can take at least 20% of price on that category and causing the model to break positive. So we're kind of doing those one at a time to make sure we don't go too far too fast. But it's still, I think I agree, like getting that into the real world is super critical. It's also a good way to get folks who aren't just hard in the data, that are running the day-to-day operations, really fired up about kind of rapid improvement and using the data to help.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And with that, I think we're at 15:15. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the conference.